Hello again, and a very warm welcome, everyone, to Holistic AI's monthly policy webinar on navigating responsible governance in generative AI. At Holistic AI, we provide comprehensive AI governance, risk, and compliance solutions for enterprises across sectors through risk management, mitigation, auditing, and assurance. With deep practical experience in auditing AI systems, we have assured over 100 enterprise AI projects across a variety of domains using our proprietary GRC platform. We are a top 100 AI company globally by CB Insights, and our clients and partners include Fortune 500 corporations like Unilever, Adecco, Cisco, SMEs, governments, and regulators. I'm Siddhant, and I will be your host for today's session. There is a lot to cover today, and we'll first start by going over the very basics, looking at some of the terms and definitions of the different types of generative AI model in discourse today. We'll then proceed onto a discussion on some of the risks these models can pose and harms as well. After which, we'll do an overview of how different jurisdictions globally are seeking to govern these models, starting from the epicenter of global AI regulation, the EU. We'll then move westward, covering the UK, the US, Costa Rica, and finally cross the Pacific to discuss emerging regulatory trends in China, Singapore, Korea, and India. So lots to do. Let's get started. As we have all seen in recent months, the discourse around generative AI, foundation models, LLMs, LGAIMs really dominates the conversation around AI today. And in this ever-dynamic, ever-changing ecosystem, it is very important to get the basics right at the very outset. And therefore, as defined under the EU AI Act's Article 28B, generative AI, or Gen AI colloquially, is a broad umbrella term referring to all AI systems specifically intended to generate, of course, with varying levels of autonomy, content such as code, text, video, images, and even audio. Foundation models, or frontier models, as the UK calls it, are a subset of Gen AI models that, according to recital 60 of the EU AI Act, are models that are trained on broad data at scale for generality of output. This, therefore, enables them to fulfill and carry out a wide variety of downstream tasks. And also, as the name suggests, these models really form the foundation for the development of more sophisticated models, which can have innumerable applications from healthcare to commerce to biotechnology and even climate change. We then move on to our third definition, which are large language models. And these models are really a subset, again, of foundation models that have been explicitly trained on large amounts of text data for a variety of natural language processing, or NLP tasks, and therefore can do a variety of things such as understand, summarize, generate, and new text-based content. So all your popular LLMs, Gen AI applications like OpenAI's ChatGPT or Google's Bard are in fact examples of LLMs. And indeed, the opportunity posed by generative AI is massive, with these models really touted to usher in a new era of computing altogether, which can enable automation, analysis, data synthesis at exponential speed and capacity, which in turn can translate to seamless efficiency, cost optimization, and proliferation of very breakthrough applications across domains like cancer research. However, and this is important, if unchecked, these systems can pose serious risks and harms. And to ensure that the ever-dynamic body of risks is comprehensively presented, we use a risk typology adapted from leading papers in the field. To start with, there's risks associated with robustness, where a generative AI model may fail to function effectively in case of adversarial attacks. If not trained adequately, generative AI models can also generate biased outputs due to improper training data, which is the second risk, which is bias and discrimination. And of course, like all other AI systems, there's a third risk of privacy, where a model may inadvertently leak a user's sensitive information or personal data. There are also risks associated with efficacy, where a generative AI model may underperform relative to its use case, not meeting baseline performance levels established by the providers of such a model. And for example, the risk of a model hallucinating or producing false outputs is definitely a testament to that risk. Generative AI models have also been seen, and increasingly so with increasing reportage, as vectors of misinformation, with real-world cases happening on the regular, where they're being used to seamlessly generate misleading and inaccurate information at scale. Such capabilities can also be abused by malicious actors, like terrorist organizations, to peddle radical propaganda by essentially co-opting a generative AI model. Similarly, there are human-computer interaction harms, or HCI harms, where users may over-rely and over-depend on generative AI models and use them in very harmful and unsafe ways, like assisted suicide. Side note, an instance of this actually happened in Belgium earlier this year. Finally, these harms could pervade beyond the digital environment, with increasing concerns from the public, from regulators, and civil society over the implications of such models replacing human labor and large carbon footprints associated with their deployment. And indeed, these risks are not scholarly, they're very real. And just a snapshot of recent reportage, as shown on the slide, exhibits the different harms these models can proliferate, from disinformation and hallucinations to privacy risks and assisted suicide. It is therefore fitting that Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI himself, testified in a recent congressional hearing in the US, saying that the risks associated with these models are quote unquote scary. And it is therefore important for regulation to step in to mitigate risks and amplify its positives. And that brings us to our next section, where we will unpack how policymakers globally are grappling with governing these models. We'll, of course, start with the nerve center of global AI regulation, the European Union, which, through the AI Act, seeks to become the global gold standard for AI governance. And just a primer for those who are unaware, the EU AI Act adopts a risk-based approach, classifying AI systems on 4 levels of risk, namely minimal, limited, high, and unacceptable risks, where obligations are proportional to the level of risk posed by an AI system. However, and very interestingly, the regulatory treatment of generative AI and foundation models under the AI Act does not fall into any of these risk levels, with a dedicated provision introduced to govern them only very recently. And so, initial versions of the EU AI Act text did not explicitly regulate generative AI, which is, of course, partly due to the novelty of the technology and correspondingly the lack of public awareness around it. More importantly, the existing structure of the EU AI Act, which was more focused and aligned towards regulating specific use cases of technology, proved to be quite counterproductive for something like foundation models, which can be used for innumerable tasks across diverse use contexts. And noting these discrepancies, the European Parliament on the 14th of June this year passed with a very large majority the latest iteration of the EU AI Act, where they introduced a new section, namely Article 28B, to cover these models. Article 28B, though being very new, is in line with the 2019 OECD principle on AI, which states that such systems should be robust, secure, and safe throughout that life cycle so that they function appropriately. Essentially, this article imposes 9 ex ante or before the fact obligations on the providers of these models, as in those who develop these models, which really range from risk identification, baseline conformance, to additional requirements for providers of generative AI models, which I will cover in detail in the next slides. So under Article 28B, providers need to ensure compliance through, number one, risk identification by mapping and mitigating reasonably foreseeable risks through appropriate design and testing interventions. They also need to ensure data governance by incorporating only those data sets during training that have met appropriate data governance safeguards, like the GDPR. They also need to ensure baseline conformance by ensuring appropriate levels of performance, interpretability, corrigibility, safety, and cybersecurity through model evaluation mechanisms like audits. A very interesting provision is the fourth one, which is on ESG norms, where providers need to develop models that are energy efficient by conforming with relevant EU standards on reducing energy usage, as well as on increasing overall energy efficiency. Providers will also have to support downstream compliance and make sure that compliance is easy for downstream operators by providing extensive technical documentation and easy to use instructions of their models. Similar to higher risk AI systems provided under Annex 3 of the AI Act, providers of generative AI and foundation models also need to establish a quality management system, or QMS, to document and ensure compliance. Providers also need to register foundation models in a public database mentioned in Article 60 of the EU AI Act, and maintain technical documentation with competent national authorities for a minimum period of 10 years after putting their product on the market. The ninth and final obligation are additional provisions for providers of generative AI systems, wherein they have to ensure compliance with transparency obligations contained in Article 52. They have to develop safeguards to ensure that the content generated by these models is in line with EU law and does not violate it. And finally, publish a summary of the use of the training data used and that is protected under copyright law. However, that is not all. There is an exemption to Article 28B, where the EU AI Act under Recital 60G says that pre-trained models designed for quote unquote narrower, less general, more limited set of applications should not be considered foundation models, therefore will not be under the purview of 28B due to their greater interpretability and predictability. The regulation also provides greater impetus on providers of Gen AI systems than operators who are downstream under Recital 60F, where providers must support downstream operators with compliance if access to a model is provided through an application programming interface or API. However, if an API access is restricted, or if the training model with data sets has been completely transferred to the downstream operator, the onus of compliance is totally on the latter. The EU AI Act, while being very comprehensive, also acknowledges the rapid pace of change in the generative AI ecosystem, and tasks the European Commission as well as the proposed AI office to periodically assess the legislative framework for changes, and also, interestingly, consider integrating audits, conformity assessments when and as required to better assure such models. So as you can see, the EU has a very comprehensive, targeted, and holistic approach when it comes to regulating generative AI. Coming to the UK, which compared to the EU has a more light touch and, in their words, a pro-innovation approach to AI. This is underscored by their recent white paper on AI regulation, and future policy making in the UK will largely be principles-based, geared towards ensuring 5 objectives, as mentioned in the slide here, ranging from safety, security, and fairness to accountability and redress. The white paper also emphasizes the integration of assurance technologies to facilitate safe AI deployment through mechanisms like algorithmic audits, and has also commissioned a central risk function within the aegis of the paper to scan and mitigate future risks in the generative AI ecosystem. The AI regulation white paper also empowers sectoral regulators to develop guidance and policy to govern generative AI in their specific domains. And recent months have seen a flurry of activity in that regard. While in earlier stages of thinking, sectoral regulators like Ofcom, the Information Commissioner's Office, the Competition and Markets Authority, and the Financial Conduct Authority, quite the soup, have already begun publishing sectoral guidance on how generative AI will impact online safety, data governance, digital markets, and the financial sector, respectively. Further, the UK government recently established the Frontier AI Task Force through the Integrated Review Refresh of 2023, whose primary objective is to build technical capacity to mitigate emerging risks arising from such models. Chaired by Ian Hogarth, the task force has received over £100 million in funding and is currently setting up a technical advisory board, while also building partnerships with industry and academia to further the safe technological development of frontier models in the United Kingdom. Moving on to more tactical initiatives that are not regulatory, there's the famous AI Summit, AI Safety Summit, announced by Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, which is scheduled to be held in early November at Bletchley Park, just a couple of hours from London. A first of its kind globally, the Safety Summit seeks to build a shared understanding on the many risks arising from frontier models, strengthen multilateral collaboration on AI safety, and provide impetus to R&D. An important pillar and objective of the summit is also to ensure that frontier models are leveraged as a force of quote-unquote public good. And to ensure that the summit process is inclusive, the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology, DSIT, is also currently organizing a series of pre-events and public consultations in the run-up to the summit. Other branches of government and broader administrative machinery in the UK are also seeking to better understand, as of now, the many risks, opportunities, and tenable solutions that can be leveraged for generative AI across sectors. The Department for Education, for instance, issued a call for public comments on the use of Gen AI in education. And the House of Lords Communication and Digital Committee also recently issued a call for evidence to better understand the state of play around large language models. Holistic AI participated in both these consultations, and do keep an eye for our responses to these in the follow-up email after today's webinar. Moving across the pond, the US's emerging approach to generative AI takes a form quite different than the EU and the UK, with an increasing impetus on decentralized policymaking and industry-driven partnerships. At the federal level to start with, the Biden-Harris administration has issued a blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights, which is largely seen as a precursor to future concerted regulatory efforts on AI, or as some call it, America's answer to the EU AI Act. There is also a new bill on the block, the AI Disclosure Act of 2023, which was introduced by Representative Richie Torres of New York's 15th Congressional District in June this year. This federal bill seeks to create greater transparency around the use of generative AI, and interestingly, has just one single requirement, mandating for any output generated by any generative AI application to just be accompanied with a disclaimer. Failure to do this will be seen as a violation of Section 18 of the Federal Trade Commission Act, the FTC Act, and non-complying entities will be subject to the same penalties as under the FTC Act, so quite massive. Moving on to more, again, tactical developments, the Biden-Harris administration has also secured 2 rounds of voluntary commitments on AI safety by leading players in the markets, which of course are OpenAI, Meta, Anthropic, Google, Salesforce, Amazon, and many others. These commitments could entail providers of generative AI models undergoing independent security assessments, publicly reporting the results of AI red teaming exercises, and also committing more resources to the R&D on product safety. Further, at the federal level, we're also seeing concerted efforts by different branches of the US government. For example, on the 11th of April this year, the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, or the NTIA, quite the mouthful, issued a request for public comments on creating earned trust for generative AI systems. Regulators in the US have also started looking into investigating some of the real-world harms arising from generative AI models, with the US Copyright Office, for example, recently launching a dedicated initiatives to better understand the nexus between the use of such models and copyright infringement. Similarly, the Federal Trade Commission, or the FTC, has also opened up an investigation against OpenAI on its privacy leaks and instances of ChatGPT generating misinformation. At the state level, there are 2 major developments on governing generative AI. The first is from the great state of Massachusetts, where Senate Bill number 31, which very interestingly was drafted using ChatGPT, seeks to establish 6 operating principles for the providers of these models. These really range from requirements on watermarking, data security, risk assessments, and preventing discrimination. Providers also need to register their models with the Attorney General of the state, which is also a signal that public registries are becoming an overly important tool in regulating generative AI applications from a transparency perspective. The second initiative is from California in the form of an executive order, which was issued in early September this year. Issued by Governor Gavin Newsom, this order contains 6 principal requirements, ranging from state agencies having to report beneficial use cases of generative AI, conducting risk analyses, submitting an inventory of high-risk AI use cases, establishing sandboxes to promote innovation, and finally, developing different types of impact assessment guidelines for different user groups and different types of AI systems for future regulatory efforts. And with the US now covered, we now move towards Costa Rica. A leader in AI regulation in the Latin America region, Costa Rica was also the first country in the region to develop a national strategy on AI. Following closely on the heels of this particular strategy this year, in May, Congresswoman Vanessa Castro introduced Bill number 23771, or the law of regulation of artificial intelligence in Costa Rica's national legislature. Like Massachusetts Senate Bill 31 that we just discussed, this was also drafted using ChatGPT and primarily seeks to establish a dedicated independent authority for all AI systems used in Costa Rica. Primarily principles-based, the regulation focuses on ensuring accountability, privacy, bias mitigation, explainability, and protection of human rights, and will be developed further through extensive public consultations and parliamentary revisions. This takes us now across the Pacific over to China. And once we reach China, it is very evident that the country's regulatory approach on generative AI, while being, of course, very different from its Western counterparts, is characterized by a more centralized and prescriptive framework. There is currently one provision on generative AI, and the Chinese Cyberspace Administration Agency, the CCA, recently enforced its administrative measures for these services, which aims to regulate various aspects of generative AI, which encompass text, coding, audio, video, image, etc., such capabilities. This framework mandates very stringent measures on data governance, bias mitigation, transparency, and intellectual property rights. A very notable feature within these regulations, and probably something that the EU took from, is the requirement for security assessments to be conducted before the release of a product. And additionally, there is a very strong emphasis in the regulation on online safety and content moderation, with developers having to ensure that the content generated by these models is free from misleading information, but more importantly, is in line with Chinese societal values. Further, providers of generative AI services are also directed to prevent discrimination while training their datasets during product development, deploy proactive filtering technologies to remove inappropriate content as per content regulation guidelines, and employ labeling techniques to watermark synthetic data or content generated by generative AI services in accordance with China's deep synthesis provisions on deepfake technologies. With this, we come to other countries in the region where we're seeing a relatively fragmented approach of sorts to governing generative AI models. Starting with South Korea, the country's data regulator, the Personal Information Protection Commission, or the PIPC, for instance, recently issued its guidelines on safe use of personal data for generative AI services, essentially sort of only focusing on the privacy risks emanating with the use of such models. On the other hand, Singapore's Infocom and Media Development Authority, or the IMDA, in June this year, released its discussion paper on generative AI, where it articulated the primary risks associated with these models. But interestingly, it followed that up with the creation of the AI Verify Foundation, which is a multi-stakeholder initiative to strengthen trustworthy AI tools through integration and uptake of AI assurance technologies, AI audits, and the development of open source technical standards. Singapore this year also happens to be the chair of the ASEAN group of nations in Southeast Asia, and to that effect has begun drafting a set of ethical guardrails for generative AI for this particular region. Called the ASEAN AI Guide, these set of rules will be jointly developed by member states, which include Thailand, Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines, etc., and is expected to be released sometime later this year. And finally, coming to India, which is now increasingly being seen as an emerging voice of influence on digital regulation. we see that the Indian government has taken a very different approach, very contrary to other countries. Concerned on clamping down on innovation quite explicitly, the Indian government has currently ruled out the need for specific regulations on generative AI. However, it continues to support and has supported the development of an industry-led code of practice. Developed by NASSCOM, a quasi-governmental organization, the guidelines for generative AI in India have been developed through extensive stakeholder consultation and provides non-binding normative requirements for developers, researchers, and users of such models to ensure safety in usage through a focus on transparency, accountability, risk management, and explainability. And with this, we end our regulatory overview. And looking forward into the future, and after really surveying this exhaustive list of countries, if there's any takeaway, it is this. These distinct regulatory paradigms obviously reflect varying policy priorities, ranging from encouraging innovation in India to safeguarding fundamental rights against harms and risks generated by these models. But this is not to say that regulatory divergence that we're seeing right now is not beneficial, as given the nascency of generative AI, it will essentially take an amalgamation of endeavors by state, non-state actors, legislative, non-legislative measures across jurisdictions to understand the relative benefits, limitations, discrepancies, and gaps in regulatory strategies when it comes to generative AI. And indeed, given the inherent uncertainty associated with these models, there is no one right approach. And only time will tell, really, as to which approach is most fit for purpose. However, and this is something all of us can agree on, there is a definite need for global consensus and alignment in the taxonomy, governance mechanisms, policy tools, assessment methodologies, and assurance techniques used to promote safety in such models. The integration of assurance technologies like AI audits and technical standards into the policy mix, therefore, is very crucial, and it would help enable a more coherent and consistent approach to governing these models. And of course, to track these emerging developments in real time, do join our waiting list for Polaris, Holistic AI's global AI regulation, incidents, lawsuits, and standards tracker at polaris.holisticai.com. With this, we come to the end of our presentation, and we'll now open the floor for questions. All right, I see a question. The question essentially wants to understand the interplay of the regulation of generative AI with the EU's Digital Services Act. So that is very interesting. And there are multiple overlaps between the EU AI Act and the Digital Services Act, both geared towards really ensuring online safety in the European Union region. While generative AI is explicitly covered under the EU AI Act, certain provisions with regards to the auditing of generative AI systems are provided in the delegated regulation that the DSA has on conducting external audits under Article 37. So it'll take an intersection of these, a combination of these, to essentially comprehensively govern generative AI from an online safety perspective. All right, anything from UN? Yes, thanks, Philip, for that question. There currently are a set of multilateral guidelines that UNESCO has released, and the UN has also been a very active participant in the Hiroshima AI process, in the G7 Hiroshima AI process, which seeks to develop multilateral partnership on governing, AI, and particularly generative AI. So yeah. All right. Another question, I'll just read it verbatim. Which areas of the EU AI Act will potentially change following the negotiations of the EU Parliament currently undertaking with the EU Council? That's an excellent question, and I don't think answers are very clear even to lawmakers legislating the EU AI Act at the moment. There did seem to be a lot of discussion around high risk and the inclusion criteria around high risk systems, but it does seem like specifically for generative AI, Article 28B, as put forward in the Parliament's proposal, will be retained. But of course, we need to see how that progresses. All right, lots of questions coming in now. Do you see the Indian approach as the prevailing one? Well, as I mentioned earlier, only time will tell as to what is best. In terms of policy discourse, there is a lot of there is a lot of buy-in that the Indian approach is getting. So as especially from the global South, given that the policy priorities from countries in this kind of economic grouping is really to amplify the benefits of AI to ameliorate innovation. However, it can also be an argument can also be made that risks are also very pronounced for those without digital literacy and all of that. So if not supplemented by adequate awareness, if not supplemented by adequate technical capacity at the government level, the Indian approach could fall short in terms of curtailing harms. But again, time will tell. Another question. Are you seeing businesses take actions to prepare for compliance and manage regulatory risks ahead of the actual issuance of new laws? Yes, that's an excellent question. Thank you, Lee, for that. Yes, we are seeing increasing number of businesses, particularly in the EU, US, and also the UK, trying to build ex-ante capabilities to better comply with emerging regulations on AI and also generative AI. Holistic AI provides a bunch of solutions in that regard, starting from our GRC platform to risk mapping, AI auditing, algorithmic assurance, etc. If we'll send some information in the follow-up mail so that you have all the information you need. Question from Jonathan. What about the last G20 meeting in India? Are there some advances from that? Excellent question again, Jonathan. Thank you for that. Yes, so the Delhi Declaration, which was released on in mid-September, I think the 13th of September, if not wrong, did have a paragraph on AI regulation. And that really, again, that really focused on ensuring that regulatory architectures be established to ensure that AI is being developed safely, ethically, responsibly, and that results of automated systems are done in an explainable manner. And this is a very big deal, especially on the heels of the G7 Hiroshima process, which also saw a lot of development on AI regulation. There seems to be increasing consensus on at least the risks pertaining to AI and generative AI applications, and the solutions aspect of it implemented either technically or through regulation are the next part. So definitely lots of movement happening over there. Question from Himangini. What are your views on self-regulatory approach as voluntary commitments? I don't think there is one correct view again. It really depends as to what developmental trajectory a country is at. For countries in the global South, self-regulatory approaches might be most fit for purpose, given that they allow enough room for innovation. They allow enough room for SMEs to innovate. However, prescriptive and more comprehensive regulatory structures, as seen in the EU or the UK, with specific provisions on sandboxing can also, be pro-innovation. As to the extent of, voluntary commitments, etc., one really has to see how those are being reported publicly, if there are kind of baseline improvements in them. But as of now, the results on that are really not clear at the moment. All right, I'm just going to take a couple of other questions. All right, another question. We are talking about requirements related to performing audits on AI systems. Are there reference checklists already available? What tenets would make audit processes effective when it comes to auditing AI solutions? Again, Soumya, thank you so much. Excellent question. Yes, there are requirements. There are reference checklists that organizations such as ours have already been developing in the space. I would encourage you to have a look at our website. We essentially map risks along 5 risk verticals, namely privacy, robustness, explainability, efficacy, and security. And corresponding to these risk parameters, there are different requirements that companies should essentially build into the AI systems. Do you have a succinct summary of each location's legal focus? Yes, Maria, thank you for that question. Yes, we do. We have many policy packs on different aspects of AI regulation. We will shortly be releasing a policy pack on generative AI as well, which provides a country-by-country overview of how each country is seeking to legislate generative AI, in what form and in what form factor as well. I would also encourage you to have a look at our blog for more in-depth analysis of different elements of regulation, such as the UK's pro-innovation approach, the EU AI Act, specifically how is that looking at conformity assessments, generative AI, the link between the EU AI Act and the GDPR, etc., etc. Yeah. All right, another question. Seem to be getting a lot of questions now. Are these regulations intended to prevent AGI? I think the goal of regulations globally, while again in different formats and in different manifestations, is really to ensure the safe development and deployment of artificial general intelligence, and of course the various subsets of that. Some, of course, are restrictive. One hears that approaches like the EU AI Act may be more stringent, but of course, there is no one regulation that is seeking to explicitly ban the use of AI, because there is global consensus on the fact that AI can bring exponential benefits across sectors, across use cycles, across societies as well. All right. All right, another question. How can organizations create solutions for global markets to ensure that they can comply to varied legal landscapes? Yes, so I mean, when it comes to compliance with different regulatory environments, there are a certain set of common principles that exist across jurisdictions. And across certain jurisdictions, and essentially one just has to have a sound articulation of the different risk parameters that are being checked for AI systems, which kind of alludes to the answer I'd given previously around risks as well. All right. A question from Alan. Are you finding that technologies exist to keep AI in compliance with the various requirements, or is compliance ahead of the needed protective technologies? I think compliance and regulatory obligations have finally started to match up to the pace in some way or the other, with the rapidity of technological development. The EU AI Act is an excellent example of that. For example, as I mentioned previously, there was no provision on generative AI, but after the implosion of large language models like ChatGPT, Bard, etc., earlier this year, the European Parliament found it essential to integrate a dedicated provision through Article 28B to specifically look at foundation models and generative AI. So whether this will change, whether this remains, whether this will be fit for purpose, of course, remains to be seen after the trilogues conclude in December. But of course, I think the catch-up is happening, and that's definitely crucial for safe development of such technologies. A question from Alex. Do you see the interpretability requirement of the EU AI Act as constraining the development of more complicated models and constrain innovation? Yes, Alex, that's also an excellent question. There was actually a very interesting op-ed by Kai Zenner in the OECD blog where he made the same point, that Article 28B of the EU AI Act might hamper innovation, especially for small and medium enterprises wanting to develop foundation models, and only strengthen companies, that large big tech companies that deploy these large language models. And what has been suggested by a lot of experts in the field is an approach more akin to the one adopted by the Digital Services Act, which is to have two classes of foundation models, one being basic foundation models where compliance burdens are not as high, and one being systemic foundation models, or the equivalent of very large online platforms, which are essentially targeted towards big tech providers and have more onerous obligations around transparency, explainability, copyright, environmental, ESG norms, etc. All right. Any other questions? All right, another question here by Himangini. Thank you. Wouldn't you say that comments on Digital India bill by the government indicates that it looks to bring some regulations on AI, such as adopting risk-based approach? Well, I think there isn't, of course, globally. Of course, in the EU, there is a lot of clarity, but globally, there isn't a lot of clarity on what a risk-based approach effectively should look like for technologies like AI. So while the integration of a risk-based approach has been done in different regulations, India being one of them, Canada also being another one through the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act. How that will manifest, how that will translate to the inclusion of different use cases remains to be seen. All right, that looks like all the questions. Unless there's nothing else, we can give back. We can give you all back your time. Yeah, thank you so much for being a part of our webinar. We hope it was useful, and do keep an eye out for a follow-up email and link to today's webinar recording on YouTube. Thank you so much. Have a nice day.